Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a Little Blue Book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 1509, and it is titled The Gay Chronicle of the Monks and Nuns, written by Joseph McCabe. This is actually part 2. Copyright date? I'm not sure. Nope. No copyright date. And let's turn that noisemaker off. Okay, here we go. Excuse me. Boy, that one got me in the morning, didn't it? Alrighty. A very pretty story. Made by the monks, of course. Now, any thoughtful man will expect that for a time at least this monistic ideal would keep bodies of men in a condition of real fervor. It was a strict logical deduction from the New Testament, the teaching of which is, in my opinion, just the rule of life for the Essenian monks of Palestine. It suited an age in which civilization was wrecked by phenomenal hordes of barbarians, and there was a very general expectation that the world was coming to an end. Moreover, these monks of England, Ireland, and Scotland, who sustained the real monastic fervor longest, were for the enormously greater part agricultural laborers, and had never been properly civilized. The countries became so disorganized when the Roman soldiers were withdrawn that many who inherited a little of the Roman culture took to the monasteries, and it is true that it is chiefly in these English and Irish monasteries that a very small amount of the Greco-Roman culture was preserved longest. But the immense majority of the monks were of slave or serf class, so densely ignorant that we can well believe that the myth of a coming end of the world and a hundredfold reward for the virtuous would keep thousands of them for a time in some sort of discipline. There we go. How long this lasted in any particular region we do not know. But what we do know is that from the 4th century onward, the majority of the monks and nuns were hypocritically idle. Of the monks and nuns, were hypocritically idle, sensual, and generally immoral. In 370, as I said, Martin of Tours took a cutting of a sacred tree to Gaul. This sounds as if there was already a beautiful monastic piety in Italy. But the hard fact is that we have an imperial rescript of that very year in which the Christian Valentinian forbids priests and monks to visit widows and orphans or accept legacies from them, and as this seems to have thrown the pious work on bishops and nuns, the same emperor 2 years later forbids these also to receive legacies. We hardly need Jerome to tell us the reason. Every actor or prostitute may inherit money, he says, but the supposedly holiest figures of the church may not. Yet he admits, and St. Ambrose agrees with him, that the law is just and necessary from the Pope. Known among the Christians of Rome as the tickler of the ears of matrons, and openly accused of more intimate familiarities. Down to the deacons and sacred virgins, the chief occupation was to get money, and they got money. What was left of the wealth of Rome passed to the churches and monks. I have only to mention here imperial decree of the time, 365 A.D., in which the Christian emperor, Valens, bitterly complains of the cowards who are flocking to the monasteries to escape military and civic duties. And you see what was taking place. The sleek and idle and sensual European type of monk was rapidly succeeding the Egyptian dervish. Mr. Cadman can make his choice. I always like to quote Saints as my historical witnesses, so we will turn to the third great saint of the West, St. Augustine, a beautiful ideal. He says time after time, and he encouraged it. His new creed played havoc with his fine intelligence. Monastery doors must be thrown wide open, he said, and no questions asked of anybody who sought admission. But he lived long enough to see the natural consequence, a swarm of bloated parasites on the community. He describes them in his little treatise on the work of the monks. Roman Africa is overrun by the creatures, he says, wandering about singularly or in pairs, selling spurious relics. The trade had already begun, and demanding the reward of their pretended holiness. He does not mention their morals, but as the whole country was profoundly immoral, it is a well-known historical fact that the savage Vandals, who came presently at once, started a purity campaign. We will hardly suppose that these men who lived on spurious relics and spurious virtues were exceptions. Civilization soon perished in Africa, so we return to Europe, and again let us listen only to saints, not to wicked culminators of piety. Saint Benedict, the famous founder of the first monastic order, the Augustinian order was not founded by Augustine, but centuries later, is the next witness for Italy, and he shows us plainly that there was no improvement whatsoever between 400 and 500. When he became famous for the austerities, he was appointed head of a monastery in South Italy, and the monks were so angry at his attempts to reform them that they tried to poison him. He tried again somewhere else, and a jealous priest first tried to poison him and then let loose 7 pretty nude girls in the garden of his monastery. So poor Benedict went off into the wilds and founded Monte Cassino and wrote his famous rule. And in the first chapter of that rule you can read today what monasticism was like in Italy and why Benedict had to make a new departure. They are gluttons and pleasure seekers. They roam all over Italy, singing or in singularly or in twos or threes, enjoying themselves. And as we hear exactly the same story from the learned Cassiodorus and from Bishop Isidore of Seville from Spain, we see plainly that in both Italy and Spain, as well as Africa, the monks were generally corrupt from the first. In both countries it was popularly believed, Cassiodorus says, that the monks descended from Anicius and Sapphira. But Benedict opens the true period of monasticism, we are reminded, and from that time onward, as a matter of fact, Europe is so grossly illiterate and literature so scanty that no one on earth can say how many monasteries founded by Benedict remained virtuous, or how long they remained virtuous. What we can say is that the picture which it is now usual to insert in our manuals of the history of the Middle Ages is quite untruthful. A plan of a model monastery is given, and perhaps a woodcut of a monk at work in the writing room, preserving the classical literature for us. These historical writings ought to know that Benedictine monks were forbidden to read or copy any but religious works, that they were the grossest forgers of lives of saints and martyrs, that they did not in the whole of the next 1,000 years preserve one single Greek classic, and they allowed a large amount of previous Roman literature to perish, and that, quite clearly, it was the dissolute and sensual monks who did copy and preserve the greater part of the Latin classics for us. Is it just as bad to depict them as models of industry? The strict monks worked partly because they needed food and partly to subdue the flesh. But to represent these few strict monasteries as the world of monks, generally to ignore entirely Benedict's own assurance that he founded a life for the select few because of the vile life of the majority, is not honest. To select the edifying parts of the rule and present that this is how monks generally lived, and say nothing about Benedict's references to swarms of monastic gluttons and pleasure seekers, is just playing up to our Catholic fellow citizens. Unfortunately, in many cities, they say whether a moral manual of history shall be used in the schools or no, and that is the literature which the Reverend Cadman consults. However, while we have much too poor a literature of the 6th century to tell in detail the history of Benedict's reform, we have most authentic evidence that before the end of the century, wealth had corrupted many, if not most, of the Benedictine monasteries. It is another saint who tells us, Pope St. Gregory the Great, in writing his valuable History of Sacerdoria Celibacy. Mr. Lee overlooked the many references to the state of the monasteries in Gregory's letters, though he does give the Pope's indignant comment on the fact that in some places the monks generally become the godfathers of children born to women who had visited their monasteries. Gregory was himself a monk and founder of monasteries, but he scorned culture, and is said by some of his Christian contemporaries to have burned the last great libraries that still lingered in Rome. He believed that the end of the world was near, and he frightened men into abandoning their property to the church. Of course, that was the foundation of the immense wealth of the papacy. But his letters revealed corruption in every part of Italy. In one region after another, his informants tell him the clergy and the monks are generally corrupt. His whole correspondence shows that he found the monks of a body idle and vicious, and he made almost no impression on them. His own diplomacy with wealthy sinners probably encouraged them to ignore his commands. He was so friendly with the wealthy apostate monk Venatus, that the man appointed the Pope guardian of his daughters at his death, and Gregory most courteously agreed, and wrote to the girls about the goodness of your parents. In other words, Venatus had paid graft. Contemporary with Gregory in the century following Benedict's supposed reform of the monks was Bishop Isidore of Seville, the best prelate and scholar of the Spanish Church, and as I have already said, he gives just the same report of the monks in his own country. There is the familiar plague of wandering monks, and the one thing in which they agree is the impurity and vagabondage of their lives. They live like brute beasts, he says, in a sordid search of pleasure. So they remained until, early in the 18th century, the Moors made an end of them in Spain. If we next turn to Gaul and Germany, we find that the initial fervor had quickly degenerated. In fact, Gaul had under its Frankish kings become one of the most lawless and sensual countries in Europe. The history of the Franks, which Bishop Gregory of Tours wrote at this period, is one of the most sordid pictures of national life that was ever written, and it confesses that the clergy and monks shared the general corruption. Pope Gregory's letters reflect the same condition, and when we find him writing, as he always does, to the noble and wealthy, to one of the most openly licentious and murderous of all the Frank princes, Eurychides. Wow, that's pretty weird. No. Brunchichilds? Brunchichildis. I'm not even going to frickin' even attempt that. About her devout mind, and describing her as filled with the piety of heavenly grace, we can understand how little influence he had on Gaul. For several centuries, monasticism in France remained generally, almost universally corrupt, and I will come back to it later. We next, in the 18th century, get to a very interesting light on the monasteries and nunneries of England. Oh, those are the places to talk about, says the Reverend Cadman. These great abbeys, with their learned bidets and Alchians, these last refuges of civilization in a darkening world, and so on. You can read that anywhere, but let me again ask you to bow to the august authority of a saint and read with me some of these terrible Latin letters which our modern clergy take care never to have translated into English. Saint Boniface goes to evangelize the Germans, but he keeps in touch with his native land. In 745 he writes to Ethelbald, king of Mercia. England was broken into petty kingdoms at the time, and although he is wonderfully polite for a saint talking to a first-rate sinner, he depicts a curious state of things. Ethelbald is, it seems, a particularly gay bachelor. He refuses to marry and is notoriously promiscuous in his amours. And the worst of it is, says Boniface to him, that we hear that you commit this ignominy mostly in monasteries, with nuns and virgins consecrated to God. Worse still, he says, he hears that the nuns, for the most part, kill the children that are born to them. Is it the first and by no means the last reference to infanticide on a large scale in nunneries? The saint politely begs his dearest son, as he calls him, not to do these naughty things, and to make the advice more effective. He reminds Ethelbald that his father and another Saxon king had behaved in exactly the same way, and encouraged their nobles to do so, and came to a bad end. This was in 765, and 2 years later we have an official intimation that Boniface is right about the nuns. One canon of a council presided over by the Archbishop of Canterbury in 747 runs, "Therefore let not the houses of nuns be hotbeds of lewd conversation, feuds, drunkenness, and vice." 40 years later the Council of Chelsea has to renew the order. Yet a letter of Alcuin later to the king of Northumbria shows that there is no change. So when in future you read about Saint Bede and the wonderful monks of England in this century, and you are asked to believe that this was the general condition of the monastic world, remember that we have abundant and indisputable evidence that the general condition of the nunneries was one of the most open carousing and philandering with the nobles, so utterly irreligious that the nun mothers for the most part killed their children. And if any man asks me to believe that the monks had no share in this gaiety of the nuns, he knows very little about the monastic world. It is the usual situation. A few strict Benedictine monasteries are thrust upon us as typical, and the evidence of the general condition is hidden to support the lie. Pardon me. And all the admonitions of councils and saints availed not. We have a speech of King Edgar of the year 969, in which it is stated that a large number of the old monasteries are now used simply for licentious meetings. We have the assurance of chroniclers of the time that only 2 of the old monasteries, of which hundreds had been built, were inhabited by monks in the middle of the 10th century. The remainder, they say, was either in ruin or were occupied by secular priests with their wives and families, or were, as the king said, used as, to put it politely, abodes of love. One chronicler of the time says that no one but a pauper would now take the vows, but Saint Dunstan reformed it all in the last quarter of the 10th century, fighting like a monk of the desert, whose practices he partly adopted, wading through streams of blood and using appalling violence. He checked the wicked monks and the nuns and forced the clergy to become celibate. Like Pope Gregory and others, he knew well that the monarch whose troops he used was one of the most vicious and destitute, but he had no hard words for him. So monasteries and nunneries again covered the land and gathered wealth. By the year 1000, more than a third of the whole wealth of England belonged to the clergy and the monks, and the Church Council of the year 1009, 20 years after the Reformer's death, let us know that the nuns are as gay as ever. You will remember that at the same time there is a reforming monarch in Germany, Charlemagne. As the clergy, whose leaders were strict monks from England, did not attempt to interfere with his own large harem, Charlemagne was quite willing to have the monks and nuns put in order, and his biographers candidly tell us how much it was needed in the 17th section of Charlemagne's Capitulary, Book of Decrees and Regulations. For the year 802 we read, wait, is that the right page? Yep, that's the right page. Okay. For the year 802 we read, it has come to our ears that numbers of abominable cases of fornication have been detected in monasteries. So Charlemagne lent his soldiers to help to chasten the monks and compel them to teach the people. And 20 years after his death, we find a church council held in his capital, Aix-la-Chapelle, complaining that in some places the houses of the nuns seemed to be brothels rather than convents. We are by this time the 10th century, at the lowest level of degradation of Europe, the age when the papacy itself was debauched for more than 100 years, and it would be stupid to expect to find more than a house here and there were under some pious abbot, whose fame is carried by pilgrims. A few score men of really religious sentiment gathered together. There was a considerable, though by no means universal, expectation of the end of the world in the year 1000. And the chroniclers plainly tell of numbers of men and women who abandoned their property and went to live in monasteries and nunneries. But even this spasm of repentance, and the new decency that was slowly spreading from the moors and Saracens, and the fervor of the cathedral building that soon began, could do no more than raise a reformer here and there, who for a time kept strict discipline in a limited number of monasteries. In France, naturally the first country to be influenced by the Moors of Spain, we find no general reform of the disputable state of things I described under the Frank kings. The general level of clergy, monks, and nuns remained gross. Alright, I think we'll stop there for part 2, and we'll return in part 3 for some more.